Uno. Hey. Okay, shall I start now? Yes, the microphone's working okay, Pedro? Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming here. So, the reason I'm giving this talk is on the 15th and 16th of July last year, the Faculty Development Committee were kind enough to pay for me to go to a conference in Manchester. You might know there's a lot of rivalry between different cities in England, and people who live in the city of Birmingham do like to say that Birmingham is the second city of England. Whereas those of us who live in Manchester will tell you that the second city in England is... No! London is England's second city. Manchester is number one. Anyway, I'm grateful for the university for supplying me with money to go to this conference, which I hope was money well spent. So what was the purpose of this conference? Well, in most universities in the English-speaking world, when you have a department of philosophy, what you really have is a department of Western philosophy. When you study the history of philosophy, you would expect to at least have the opportunity to study philosophy in ancient Greece, European philosophy in the Middle Ages, which might include a bit of Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy in there. And then you would study European philosophy of the early modern period. And of course, when you get up to contemporary philosophy, that would include philosophy in contemporary Europe, Australia, the United States. But it's as though the rest of the world, the non-Western world, doesn't even exist. And there are, in fact, many people who would say that philosophy is a distinctively Western activity. I should add, of course, if you go to a university in the English-speaking world, you would have plenty of chances to study non-Western philosophy, but usually not in a philosophy department. You could study Chinese culture and civilization. You could study the religions of the world, which would give you a chance to study Buddhist philosophy and Jain philosophy and so on. But usually, if you took a class in the philosophy department, the focus would generally be on Western philosophy. When we talk about changing the agenda to try to have global philosophy, the question is, should we be changing the curriculum in philosophy departments? Why should it be changed? And exactly how should it be changed? Now, in the conference itself, one of the most memorable moments was when one of the presenters told a little anecdote, a true story, which illustrates just how deep-seated the prejudice against non-Western philosophy is. The speaker was a lady called Keokok Lee, who spent many years teaching philosophy in the University of Manchester and is now retired. Keokok Lee, she did her undergraduate studies in the University of Singapore. Then she began her postgraduate studies in philosophy in Oxford, where she was supervised by Gilbert Ryle. And to understand why this story had such an impact, you need to understand that at that time, Gilbert Ryle was probably the most powerful philosopher in England. Not necessarily the most important in terms of his writings, but the most powerful because of his administrative positions. From 1945 to 1967, Gilbert Ryle was the Waynflete Professor of Metaphysics in Oxford, and he was also the architect and really the director of Oxford's graduate program in philosophy. Also, from 1947 to 1971, Gilbert Ryle was the editor of Mind, which was by far the most prestigious philosophy journal in the United Kingdom. And when I say he edited the journal, he read every single article that was submitted to the journal, and he made a personal decision about whether these articles should be published or not. So he had a lot of power as a gatekeeper in the world of philosophy. A word from Gilbert Ryle could make your career if you were a philosopher. Literally a single word. On one occasion, somebody applied for a job. They asked Gilbert Ryle to provide a letter of recommendation. So Gilbert Ryle sent a postcard with the word, yes. And that was enough to get you a job back then. The reason being, so many philosophy departments trusted Gilbert Ryle as being able to tell you, this is a good philosopher, you should employ them, this person is not. This is why then when Key-Cockley was having her very first meeting with Gilbert Ryle, it would have been a very intimidating occasion. She was meeting a very powerful man. She knocked on the door, went into his office, and the very first thing he said to her was, "There is no such thing as Chinese philosophy." Now, as he would have known from looking at her file, she hadn't, of course, applied to Oxford hoping to study Chinese philosophy. She had a deep interest in analytical philosophy, which is what you would expect to study in Oxford. And just think for a moment about the import of that statement. If you were studying, say, literature at a postgraduate level, you might decide that you want to focus on Spanish literature and study Cervantes. And you could apply to a department where the department is just a department of Spanish literature. Or if you were studying history, you might decide that you want to study modern European history. And there would be plenty of departments that would simply be departments where you focus on modern European history. But nobody would think to say to you, the only literature is Spanish literature, or there's not even any such thing as Chinese literature. Okay? People would agree that Chinese literature exists, it's a thing, even if in that particular department it isn't something that's studied. Now, I certainly don't want to defend Ryle's statement about there being no such thing as Chinese philosophy. That anecdote is kind of like a textbook example of institutional racism. But why did ideas like that become so deep-seated in philosophy departments? And because I'm telling this story about Gilbert Ryle, it was interesting to those of us at the conference because we know that Gilbert Ryle was such an influential figure. But the view that he expressed is a typical view for philosophers of his generation. Well, as far as Ryle was concerned, true philosophical work can only be done in an environment where any authority can be challenged, and where claims must be decided by appeals to reason, not by appeals to authority. And this is why Ryle rejected a lot of work that was done in universities in France or Germany as not being truly philosophical. So it wasn't just Chinese philosophy he rejected, he was very, very dubious about a lot of French so-called philosophy. The impression that English-speaking philosophers had of French and German universities at the time, an impression that might be true or false, is that if you studied in a university in France or Germany, the professor would hold forth, you would take notes, and then in your exams and your papers you would be expected simply to parrot back whatever the lecturer said. Whereas British universities prided themselves on creating an environment where you would be expected to challenge the professor. Just incidentally, I don't know what would have happened if, when Gilbert Ryle had said there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy, I don't know what would have happened if Key-Cockley had said to him, "Oh yes, there is," and challenged his point of view. Maybe there would have been an interesting discussion. But meeting her supervisor for the first time, she didn't challenge him, understandably, in that situation. Now, challenge to authority then, that is a key element that is necessary to have philosophy. The story of Western philosophy begins in Greece. It's true that Socrates was not the first Greek philosopher, but he has emerged as the archetypal philosopher. And after all, we refer to Socrates before, we refer to those philosophers who came before Socrates as pre-Socratic philosophers, indicating, yeah, philosophy kind of was all a prelude to Socrates, and it's with Socrates that philosophy really gets going. Now, Socrates was executed on a charge of atheism. Plato on whom we defend for our knowledge of Socrates, portrays Socrates as being innocent of atheism, but certainly guilty of leading a rebellion against received wisdom and accepted social mores. The philosopher is the rebel. Centuries later, Christians were accused of being rebels. Because Christians rejected the gods of paganism, Christians were accused of being atheists. One Christian response was to say that Christianity itself was the true philosophy. Justin Martyr said that Christians were fulfilling the dreams of Socrates, the quest for truth and wisdom. Consequently, when Christianity was adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire, although pre-Christian religion was suppressed, although paganism was suppressed, pagan temples were shut down, Greek and Roman philosophy was accepted. It was celebrated because it was seen as providing independent intellectual support for some of the fundamental truths on which Christianity was based. But by the 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment, there was a growing awareness that philosophy could be used to criticize as well as to support Christianity. The single most important philosopher of the Enlightenment period, the person who set the tone, is Immanuel Kant. And the titles of some of his most famous works indicate a desire for a purified philosophy. Critique of pure reason. Religion within the bounds of reason alone. Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to present itself as a science. So, those were the works that set the philosophical agenda for a couple of centuries. But Kant was also responsible for the exclusion of non-Western philosophy from the agenda. One of Kant's lesser-known works is a book called Physical Geography. This book is actually a selection of Kant's lectures, his notes, and some random essays, or some essays that deal with physical geography, that was edited by Theodor Rinck in 1802, 2 years before Kant died. It's such an obscure work that it wasn't even translated into English until 2012. One reason that this book is now attracting a lot of attention is that we learn from it about Kant's views on race. Kant actually considered that people who were not white were literally incapable of doing philosophy. And he discusses different races and says, like, yeah, the Hindus, they can learn crafts from other people, but can't really manage independent thinking. Concerning the Chinese, he says, philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient. Their teacher, Confucius, teaches in his writings nothing outside a moral doctrine designed for the princes, and offers examples of former Chinese princes, but a concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese. Now, when Kant wrote this, it isn't as though Western philosophers before Kant had been so dismissive of Chinese philosophy. Europeans first encountered the thought of Confucius in the 17th century, thanks to the letters and journals of a Jesuit missionary called Matteo Ricci. Then, in 1687, the Flemish Jesuit Philippe Couplet published a Latin translation of Confucian writings. And it is because of Matteo Ricci and Philippe Couplet that we still talk in English about Confucius, which is a Latinized name, when we're speaking about the Chinese thinker who is called Kongzi in Mandarin. Okay. Ricci thought of Confucius as being the Chinese equivalent of Plato. Matteo Ricci's idea is that the Chinese could become Christians without having to give up their reverence for Confucius, and without having to cease performing rituals honoring their ancestors. So Matteo Ricci was saying to his fellow missionaries, treat Confucius as a philosopher who can be revered in China in just the same way that we still revere Plato in Europe. But other missionaries, Dominican and Franciscan missionaries, saw Confucius not as a philosopher, but as a religious figure. And their idea was, if the Chinese are going to become Christians, they will have to give up any reverence for Confucius, just in the same way that when the Romans became Christians, they had to give up reverence for gods like Jupiter. Now, in the 17th century, Europeans could still believe in this very idealized picture of China as an intellectual's paradise where government ministers were selected primarily for their philosophical ability. By the 18th century, China was seen in Europe as a despotic, repressive society. Perhaps this explains why, for Kant, Confucius could be dismissed as a religious figure, and a religious figure in the worst sense for Kant, a mere supporter of the status quo, a dead authority to be appealed to by people who did not want to contemplate any kind of social change. In any case, I think here we start to understand one of the big obstacles to the Western reception of non-Western philosophy. From the 18th century onwards, the central thrust of much Western philosophy was to find a way to base societies on principles that are entirely rational and that did not rest upon any form of religious authority. In 1945, Bertrand Russell, who was truly one of the great British philosophers of the 20th century, published his History of Western Philosophy. And Russell went so far as to suggest that Thomas Aquinas was not a philosopher. Now, Thomas Aquinas is usually considered one of the great philosophers of the Middle Ages. But Russell said all Aquinas was doing was trying to find arguments to support conclusions which, as a Catholic, he already accepted as a matter of faith. And that kind of work, said Russell, is not really philosophy. Now, the thing to bear in mind, though, if philosophers are then saying, so somebody like Aquinas doesn't count as a philosopher because he's a bit too religious, nor are they likely to accept as philosophers people from other cultures whose writings seem to be presented as primarily, first and foremost, religious writings. So, I have here a copy of a book that was published in 1957, a source book in Indian philosophy, edited by Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, a scholar of Indian thought who was also the second president of the Republic of India, and Charles A. Moore, who was a professor of philosophy in the University of Hawaii. So this book was put together to promote the study of Indian philosophy by Western philosophers. In the introduction, the editors list some of the characteristics of Indian philosophy. And they say, of course, Indian philosophy is deeply spiritual. Indian philosophy is primarily religious. It values intuition rather than reason. Indian philosophy is based on respect for the authority of ancient sources. Now, if you are going to reject Aquinas as not being truly a philosopher, then, based on what Radhakrishnan and Moore say, and they're trying to say this is what Indian philosophy is like, you would be inclined to reject Indian philosophy as not really being philosophy as well. And if you look at the choice of texts in the anthology, they say Indian philosophy is based on reverence for ancient sources like the Vedas, okay? Ancient scriptures. And so the first thing that you would find in this anthology are extracts from the Vedas. The anthology includes extracts from the Mahabharata, that great Indian epic. The thing is, if I were to come up with an anthology of Western philosophy, I wouldn't have extracts from the book of Genesis. I wouldn't have the works of Shakespeare. Okay? The book of Genesis, the works of Shakespeare, they're classics, they're central texts of Western civilization. But when we talk about philosophy, we don't mean the whole Western tradition. You expect a philosophy department to pick a few texts from the Western tradition that count as philosophy. So, John Locke is a great philosopher. Shakespeare is a great poet, but poetry and philosophy are two different things. Now, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as Indian philosophy. I'm not saying that none of the texts included in this anthology count as Indian philosophy. But bearing in mind that you already had an environment where in the English-speaking world there's this great prejudice against Indian philosophy to begin with, and when Indian philosophy is promoted primarily on religious grounds as being primarily a spiritual system, that provides for philosophers an easy reason to dismiss it. Not to dismiss it and say, nobody should study this, but to say, yeah, it's fine that people should want to study these texts. They should go to the Department of Sanskrit Studies, or perhaps to the Department of Religion and Theology. Departments of religious studies have been much, much more open to the study of non-Western thought than departments of philosophy have been. But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. There is such a thing as Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy, and we could maybe add African philosophy, Native American philosophy. What is needed are people with a deep knowledge of Chinese, Indian, African, Latin American culture, who also have sufficient understanding of Western philosophy that they can pick out parts of the other cultures that are of real philosophical interest. And there are now a lot of people who have carried out work like this. With regard to Indian philosophy, you have Bimal Matilal, Janardhan Ganeri, J. Garfield, Graham Priest, for example. The groundwork has now been done. Even Florida State University now actually offers in the philosophy department a class in classical Indian philosophy, although I'm not actually sure who teaches that class. Let me give an example now designed to show that we can talk about such a thing as Chinese philosophy. In the 14th century, Emperor Taizu, the founder of the Ming dynasty, sought to erase from copies of the works of Mingzi, who was a great Confucian thinker, he sought to erase from copies of the works of Mingzi any passages where Mingzi criticized the ruler, because he thought that criticism of the ruler sets a bad example. He then decided to go further by removing from the shrine of Confucius the tablets that commemorated and reverenced Mingzi. And he said, any minister who opposes this eradication of Mingzi will be executed. Qian Tang arrived at court to meet with the emperor, and he brought with him a coffin. And he said, it would be an honor to die for Mingzi. Now, if Qian Tang had behaved like this in a European court, you would talk perhaps about him showing a Socratic spirit. When he behaves like this in China, we would have to talk about him showing the Confucian spirit. You see, by the time Matteo Ricci came to China, it was during the period of the Ming dynasty, and by that time within China, Confucius had simply become an unassailable cultural icon. Everybody had to show respect for Confucius. And it was assumed, it was taken for granted, that of course Confucius would have supported the Ming dynasty. But if you want to understand why did Confucius become a significant thinker in the first place, it's worth bearing in mind that long before the Ming dynasty, the founder of the Qin dynasty, Xie Huangdi, wanted to have the works of Confucius destroyed. In his day, Confucius was considered a subversive figure. If you look at Confucius, the subversive figure, it becomes much harder to deny that he was a philosophical figure. Now, after this conference, I have made a concrete change to the Introduction to Philosophy class that I teach. I am now going to include in that class, alongside writings from ancient Greece, passages from the works of Mingzi and Chunzi, two philosophers who disagreed about whether human nature is good or bad. They didn't literally meet and debate this. Chunzi lived after Mingzi, but Chunzi works out his ideas through criticism of Mingzi. The reason for including these two in the Introduction to Philosophy class is twofold. First, there's a simple reason why I don't include Confucius in Introduction to Philosophy, and that is Confucius is already part of the Introduction to World Religions class I teach. And it wouldn't be good for students who took both of those classes to go through the same material on Confucius twice. So what needs in Introduction to Philosophy needs to be something other than the Analects of Confucius. Secondly, focusing on a disagreement in Chinese philosophy means that students will be immediately aware that when I talk about Chinese philosophy, I'm not taking a single figure and saying this person, this individual represents the Chinese way of thinking. If you imagine a culture that is completely homogeneous, where everybody in that culture thinks the same way, then you are imagining a culture that has no philosophy. Philosophy exists where disagreement exists. And this is another reason why it has been hard for people in the West to grasp the existence of non-Western philosophy. It is true that from a pedagogical perspective, if I'm trying to introduce you to a culture you're not familiar with, of course I will start by trying to simplify things. And in an introductory class, it's likely someone will say, people in India all believe. People in Latin America all suppose. Everybody in the United States thinks that. That homogenized picture of a culture is almost certainly false, but it tends to be the first impression that people draw. If you only ever read one Chinese writer, you're much more likely to believe this is just what all Chinese people think. You understand the philosophy within a culture when you come to understand the disagreements and the debates within the culture. And this, finally, gives me a chance to explain what I consider the goal of global philosophy to be, and what I don't consider it to be. When I talk about global philosophy, I'm not implying that philosophers should support a philosophy of globalism, whatever that means. Just as to say that education should be multicultural is not the same as saying that education should teach multiculturalism. The end point, the goal of philosophy, is not to create harmony. It's not saying that philosophy should be global, is not saying that the philosopher should say, so everybody all over the globe, it turns out, believes exactly the same things. And hey, it turns out Confucius, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, the Buddha, they were all saying exactly the same message. There is only one message. A global philosophy should focus on disagreements, disagreements within a culture, and disagreements between one culture and another. Philosophy promotes disagreement and debate because ideas should be tested by being subjected to the most rigorous criticisms. A great athlete would want to compete in the Olympics or in the World Cup because you want to test yourself against the best people from around the world. So great athletes look for competitions like, as I say, the World Cup, the Olympic Games. Not, of course, competitions like the World Series, which is not really a world event at all. So too, in the same way, a philosophy department that aspires to teach people, to train people how to be really good philosophers should try to subject them to the same standards of study and criticism, which means challenging yourself by looking at the best thinkers from around the world. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me, and I guess this leaves us a bit of time for questions. Yes, okay. Do people need to have the microphone for questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that the current state of the world, I mean, for example, the current war between the US and Iran will represent a barrier for this intercultural change of philosophy? Like, for example, do you think that this war, for example, could represent an impediment for Islam philosophy to enter the US?
No, because the First and Second World Wars were not any kind of barrier for an interchange between German-speaking and English-speaking philosophers. When England, or when the Allies were fighting against the Germans, I don't think anybody in any British philosophy department would have doubted the importance of Immanuel Kant as a great philosopher. So wars between nations don't generally undermine the kind of long-term exchange of ideas that philosophers engage in. And again, it would be perfectly consistent for somebody to say, you know, let's say for somebody to say, I favor fighting against Iran right now, what they're doing is dangerous and so on, and also to say Persian philosophy is incredible, and the Persians made huge contributions to world thought that we should study and try to understand.
I want to add, of course, that
even during the war, you know, certainly you had some philosophers that had facilitated the rise of the Nazis and Nazi Germany, and you had some that would have totally opposed the rise of Nazi Germany. So societies are complex, philosophers think differently, and so just like now you reminded me of that period during the times of Alfonso el Sabio in Spain, Alfonso the Wise, where Jewish philosophers and religious figures would get together, you know, Muslims, Jews, and in this case, Christians, and debate ideas. So even though, as you know, Spain at that moment for 700 years was involved in the Reconquista, trying to, the Christian world, trying to push out the Moors that had invaded and that had a different religion. But so debate goes on.
Yeah, and I'll just say it the same way. In the history of India, it was the Mughals, the Muslim rulers, who were also known for sponsoring and promoting interreligious debates. And a lot of this is where you find the rational element in Indian philosophy coming to the fore. And it's an example. I've said I think there are a lot of Western philosophers who have this prejudice against the mixing of philosophy and religion. Of course, teaching philosophy and religious studies, I don't have that. What you have in India as well is an example of people saying, we've got these two different religions. Can we try to understand their similarities, their differences, and engage in the quest for truth by using some kind of a shared rational method? Yeah.
So when philosophers, so if you say that philosophers agree that these Eastern civilizations and Eastern beliefs such as Buddhism, does it count as philosophy because they don't exactly, I mean, they are in fact deeply rooted in ancient beliefs, or Hinduism at least. But when you say, wouldn't arguing that these Eastern ways of thinking are in fact philosophy, doesn't that do the same thing in the sense that it sort of defies the authority that philosophers have over saying what is philosophy and what isn't? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yeah, with Buddhism, you do have the emergence of what is sometimes called Buddhist logic or Buddhist epistemology, which began as an attempt to set out rules for debates. So you've got a difference of opinion. How are we going to try to settle this rationally? Now, this was done in the name of promoting Buddhism. There are some writers, though, who have argued that this was ultimately detrimental to Buddhism. Let me see. Ronald Davidson, I think his name is, have argued that as soon as Buddhists started doing that, they were going to undermine a commitment to the Buddhist religion, because people were asking what's rational or irrational, not what would be required if I am going to be true to Buddhist principles. What that really shows us, though, is debates that you find within the history of Christianity have their parallels within the history of Buddhism. In both cases, you have people who take what we might call a more fundamentalist approach, saying, hey, once we start appealing to reason, might that not be a threat to our religion? But also, you had people promoting the rational approach. And furthermore, a byproduct of this is people who start by promoting a rational approach to religion, then simply start outlining, well, what do we mean by a rational approach anyway? What are principles of logic that we can all agree on? What's happened now, which is interesting, is we now have a situation where there are a few philosophers like Graham Priest, who is not in any way a religious philosopher, but who has promoted the study of Buddhist works, mainly because it coincides with work that is being done independently in the study of logic. Graham Priest is famous as a proponent of non-classical logics, which are an exciting thing for people who are interested in mathematical logic, working out alternative sets of rules and seeing what are the consequences of these different rules. And it turns out that for people who are interested in alternatives to classical logic, not only for Buddhists, but the Jains came up with a lot of ideas that purely from a logical point of view have a great interest. Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
I don't think if my question will be understood, but when I was listening to your talk, I was thinking that, for example, in the past, people accepted more like Western philosophies. Maybe it was because of the historical period, because I was seeing that nowadays, like Oriental, I don't know how to say it, like Eastern philosophies are being more welcome nowadays. Why is that? Is it because of the historical period we are experiencing now, or it has nothing to do with it?
Oh, it certainly has a lot to do with the historical period. I mean, if we're trying to understand the Western reaction to Eastern philosophy, and especially, of course, in the case of the British, you cannot overlook the history of imperialism and colonialism. Now, if you go back to the 19th century, if you were looking for a place to study Indian culture, Oxford would have been a very good bet. The reason being that plenty of students would expect to spend 3 years studying in Oxford, and then they would go and it would be like, okay, here's like a city in India, we're going to put you in charge. So people would know, if that's going to be your job, you want to understand Indian civilization well. But you want to understand it well because you see yourself as stepping in there as the ruler of these people. And so it's like, let's find out what Indians believe, because if you understand what people believe, you can use that to manipulate them and to control them. Even then, people in the British Empire spoke about how certain people would go native. There are plenty of examples of people who might have gone to India with imperial ambitions, learned something about Indian languages and Indian culture because they were going to be the rulers, but who were conquered by the ideas that they studied and decided, hey, I'm going to embrace an Indian way of life. Imperial authorities, in turn, were worried about this happening. And so you could argue that there was a tendency to try to segregate the study of a foreign culture in such a way as to make it clear, we want you to study this, but we don't want you to embrace it, because that would make you a traitor to your own culture. This is why people who worked for the British government in India were encouraged to dress in the English way, to play English games, to keep alive within themselves the spirit of English culture. Because if they didn't, you might lose the boundary between the British and the Indians, and then what would happen? Potentially the empire might collapse. Well, now, the empire has collapsed. Okay, and that now makes it much more easier for people in British universities to say, okay, let's look on other cultures not as being cultures that we want to understand and control, but which can be treated as equals.
This reminds me of the tremendous sort of impact or influence that Orientalism, for example, had at the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s, in not just in Great Britain, but in other places. I remember the ideas of Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, and all of this. There was a tremendous influence of not just Buddhism, but other, Oriental ideas within the European milieu as a result of this.
Yes, and this is exactly the source of the problem. Orientalism meant the Orient, the East, was presented as glamorous, exciting, attractive, because it is not like the West. And part of what was presented as so attractive about the Orient is, in the Orient, they're not so concerned about things like science and rationality. And so, if Eastern thinking is presented as being, if Eastern thinking is presented as being exciting to you, if you want to reject reason, then of course, philosophers who see themselves as the guardians of reason are not going to want to embrace that. But the way the perception of Eastern thinking has changed is we've gone from a situation where Indian thinkers who reject reason are seen as the archetypal Indian thinkers, to a situation where we can say, look, both in Western history and in Indian history, there's been a constant dialectic between thinkers who present themselves as more rational and between thinkers who say, let's try to go beyond reason. You can find spirituality, rejection of reason in the Western tradition. And you can find in the Indian tradition materialism, rationality, and attempts to combine the two. Is it time for us to eat now? Okay, that's excellent, because I'm certainly in the mood for pizza myself. Thank you all for some excellent questions. Thank you.